Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for Uncovering the Hidden Dangers of Asbestos, Understanding its Risks, Sources, and Safe Mitigation Strategies. I'm Sarah Chadwick, Marketing Director with CRC, and with the help of Heather Zosia, Senior Account Manager with Element Building Sciences, we'll be your moderators today. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers today, Mike Schaan, CEO and Principal Consultant with Element Building Sciences, and Tyler Katrana, Project Director with CRC. I'll turn it over to them to tell you a little bit more about themselves, and then we'll start uncovering the hidden dangers of asbestos. Tyler?
Thank you, Sarah. My name is Tyler Katrana. I'm a National Project Director with CRC, Commercial Restoration Company. We wanted to present this, Uncovering the Hidden Dangers of Asbestos. We really felt it was an important topic to discuss or revisit for some of you. Among the many other things that Michael's going to discuss today, one specific point we wanted to highlight is some information covering the square foot removal and amounts and some information or lack of information and knowledge concerning the EPA versus OSHA guidance. So we will delve into some of these interesting issues, and ultimately we want to protect people's life safety and then possible protection of liabilities of individuals and other companies as well. So without further ado, I'm happy to introduce Michael Schaan with Element Building Sciences. Michael, please take it away.
Thank you, Tyler. My name is Mike Schaan, and I'm a principal consultant with Element Building Sciences. We're based in Denver, Colorado. As it relates to the topic today, I am an EPA certified asbestos building inspector, management planner, and project designer. And we're going to be talking about some very interesting things today. I know asbestos can be not interesting, but as Tyler noted, there's a couple things here when it comes to health, safety, protecting the value of your asset, property management companies, things like that. There's some really good information that you should be aware of, and we'll get right into it. So today we're just going to cover some basics. Will be a high-level presentation of asbestos, and so we're going to be talking about what it is and how it was used back in the day and even today, and some dangers associated with asbestos in the built environment, and that means in buildings, residential homes, commercial properties, industrial complexes, things of that nature, some EPA guidance, and we're also going to be getting into OSHA just a little bit, activities that can expose you or anyone in a building to asbestos. And then we'll have a question and answer session at the end of our topic. To get right into it, what is asbestos? We hear about it a lot, and some diseases with it. Really, asbestos, it's a naturally occurring mineral found in the ground. It's found in the earth. There are places even today where you can walk around and just find asbestos lying about. A good way to think about it as we discuss asbestos today, and I've done in many trainings before, is think of asbestos as a rock, just like a piece of gravel or granite or anything like that, and it is naturally occurring. There are many types of asbestos, but really we're going to be talking about 6 regulated materials today. The most common ones are chrysotile or chrysotile, amosite, which is brown, chrysotolite, which is blue, and then tremolite, anthophyllite, and actinolite. We run across those in our sampling strategies occasionally, but 95% of the asbestos that we find in the built environment is chrysotile or chrysotile. It is a product that was very commonly added to building products over the years. And as I said, these materials are still in use today. We're going to really talk about some important topics, but just remember we're dealing with a rock. Asbestos production, it is not mined in the United States anymore, fortunately. There's a couple of very large open pit mines like you see in this picture here. The last open pit mine in the United States was shut down or closed in 2002. It was in Southern California. There was another very large open pit mine in Libby, Montana, that was open for many, many years. And asbestos is still mined in 5 or 6 countries: Russia, China, Brazil, Kazakhstan, and India. The major producers in the world today are from Russia and China. And just imagine, we've heard of all of the dangers of asbestos. Look at this open pit mine without any PPE controls, without any air controls, and one can just imagine how asbestos fibers were spread from these areas throughout the neighboring cities and towns, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Question is, why was asbestos used? And when you think about it, it is actually a very, very good product. It's naturally occurring, so you didn't have to process it like we see petroleum products. You didn't have to manufacture it. You simply had to go down and mine it. It is very stable at high temperatures. Asbestos actually will not burn. And so it was added to many products just for fire safety. It does not conduct any electricity, which is fantastic. If you look at older homes where the main electrical panel is mounted to the outside of the home, in between that electrical panel and the house itself, you can find a black, it looks like slate. And what it protected the house from starting on fire because of all of the heat generated in the electrical panels. Older homes, and more so on federal buildings, there's some old wiring. It's called knock and tube. And the copper lines were actually wrapped with fiber asbestos so that they wouldn't heat up and start fires. It is inert to acids and bases, to acids and alkalines. And I always remind people, think back if you took any chemistry lab classes in high school or in college, something like that, and they all had these really thick black tables. And asbestos was actually added to those. It's called black asbestos or black asbestos cement. So if your Bunsen burner tipped over, if you spilled an acid on it, nothing would really happen. So that's why it was added to those different products. It's very resistant to abrasion. It's still added to many types of flooring tiles, these even now, primarily in commercial settings. If you see 12 by 12 vinyl floor tiles that are really, really very thick, very hard, they're built, asbestos is added to that because it's very durable, working with all of the high foot traffic that you would have in a commercial space. And it also has a very high tensile strength. It's added to a lot of products, joint compound, drywall texture, things like that. And it almost has a crystalline structure. And we'll look at that in a moment. It's a very good product. The problem with it is when the asbestos fibers are released into the air and they're breathed in. And that's where we have 3 diseases that's caused by asbestos, and we'll discuss those momentarily. Here we are. There's 3 diseases caused by asbestos. And again, remember back what I was saying, we're working with a rock here. Asbestosis is a scarring of the lung tissue. We have lung cancer, which is a tumor of the bronchi covering, and mesothelioma, which is a cancer of the chest lining, the mesothelia or the pleural. If sometimes you can't sleep at night and you hear about you go on TV and you see these attorneys. Have you ever worked in a shipyard? They talk about mesothelioma. That's a very, very bad disease that it's really quite bad. So we're going to look at how these 3 different diseases are generated in your lung tissue. So if you can see my mouse moving around here, we're going to first talk about asbestosis. A good way to think of asbestos fibers, these are microscopic. They have very sharp hooks and barbs in them. When I do training classes, I think of, okay, imagine you're breathing in thousands and thousands of microscopic fish hooks. They are drawn into your lungs. They attach to your lung tissue. The body recognizes that there's a foreign object there. And so the first thing we try and do is we try and cough. And we cannot cough out all of the asbestos fibers because they've actually attached to our lung tissue. And that's going to happen right here in your right lung and your left lung. And further down, we have what are called the alveoli. And this is where carbon, the CO, and oxygen are exchanged in your body. The first time anybody really thinks they have a problem is when they go to see their doctor and they cannot breathe very well. And it's because these asbestos fibers have attached themselves into the into the alveoli. The second cancer, or the second disease, is lung cancer. And you can see these branches coming off here into your lung tissue. These are the bronchia. And what happens is asbestos fibers attached to the bronchial lining here. Again, the body recognizes there's a foreign body in it. And so the first thing it does is it puts our immune systems into overdrive and sends macrophages to try and break it down. We're dealing with a rock. The body says, okay, we cannot break this down. So if we cannot remove it from the body, we're going to start encapsulating it like this and causing small microscopic tumors to grow. And that's what lung cancer is. It's microscopic tumors that are growing on the bronchia. The third disease, and obviously the most severe of the three, is called mesothelioma. If you look at your organs here, so you have your abdomen, you have your lungs, and your heart, all of these organs are inside of a very thin sac called the pleural lining. And when your lungs are inflating and deflating as we breathe all the time, there's a very slick sliding surface in between your lungs and this pleural lining. Asbestos fibers are drawn into this pleural lining on the edges here, and they become attached and they cannot be handled by the body. And so again, these small tumors start to grow. That is called mesothelioma. Of these three diseases, if you could pick and choose the one that you did not want to have, we're talking about mesothelioma. It is nearly always deadly. With some recent breakthroughs in medical technology, they're saying now that approximately 5 or 6% is about the highest survival rate you can get from mesothelioma. Something else that's really important to understand is the first two diseases, asbestosis and lung cancer, are called dose response diseases. And what that means is the higher dose you're exposed to, the longer time you are exposed to that dose, the greater your chance is of getting either asbestosis or lung cancer. So it kind of makes sense. The higher dose, the longer you breathe it in, the worse it is, the greater your chance of getting one of those diseases. Mesothelioma is a whole different animal, and it's very bad because even one dose of asbestos fiber into your pleural lining can cause mesothelioma. Think back of these asbestos miners when they were in these open pits. Obviously, their chances of getting asbestosis and lung cancer were greater because they were breathing this dust in for 30, 40 years. Just imagine with mesothelioma, an exposure of one fiber once in your life can cause it to start happening in your lungs. The other thing that's really bad about these diseases and asbestosis exposure is the latency period, meaning the time from when you were exposed to the time that the diseases start to present in your body. For asbestosis, it's somewhere around 10 years or so, 10 to 20 years. With lung cancer, it's about 20 years or so, plus or minus a little bit. With mesothelioma, it's 30 to 40 years down the road. So think if you're a young worker, we can do anything, we can breathe in anything, and we're exposed to this, the chances of these diseases presenting are 30, 40, sometimes 50 years down the road when we're really should be thinking about retirement and spending time with our grandkids. And a lot of times, no one knows that they have these diseases until they start to think, well, okay, I'm coughing a lot or my chest hurts. They go into their doctor and they get a chest x-ray and they see all of these little tumors or dark spots in their lungs. And that's why it's so bad. The other thing too, remember, we're dealing with a rock. And so even if it is found in your lungs, you cannot take chemotherapy to get rid of it. You can't take any type of radiation treatment to inoculate it. Once it is in your lung tissues, it is there. And that is why I really, really talk very much about PPE, your personal protective equipment, all the time. We're going to continue on here. But I want to go over some commonly used terms as we are frequent in our line of work. We use the acronym ACM quite a bit, and that just stands for asbestos containing material. And the way that the EPA, who regulates asbestos in the United States, the way that they've defined an asbestos containing material is a material that contains greater than 1%. Interesting that they don't say it's a material that contains any asbestos, because there is some naturally occurring asbestos in the air. And if you go to Southern Nevada, for example, if you're out hiking, you can again see asbestos just naturally occurring on the ground. So there is some background asbestos in air and on surfaces. So the EPA has said If it's greater than 1%, that's when we're going to start regulating it. If we have a building material that contains 1% or less, it's considered unregulated by the EPA. But there's going to be a trick about this here in just a couple of minutes. Friable. Friable is very important to understand. What that means is we can take a material and just under hand pressure, we can pulverize it a little bit or cause asbestos fibers to be released and come into the air. That's a very important topic when it comes to asbestos abatement or asbestos removal, because it costs much less to remove an asbestos containing vinyl floor than it is drywall, for example, because vinyl floors, you can simply take a device, a pry bar or something, and snap up to the vinyl tiles and bag them and discard them. But when you're removing a drywall ceiling or drywall wall, for example, you can imagine all of this dust and asbestos fibers being released into the air. So the topic of friability is very important to remember. Trigger levels, that is the amount of asbestos containing material in a space or in a building material like walls, vinyl flooring, things like that. And trigger levels are important to us from a sampling perspective because the EPA is mandated that we have to collect a certain number of asbestos samples based on what material we're sampling, what its texture is, what its color is, but again, by how much there is. A couple of trigger levels we can discuss here, and this is now we're going to talk about federal law. In commercial buildings, it's 160 square feet of texture. It is 260 linear feet of, let's say, cove base or some small steam piping, things like that, or what you can put into the volume equivalent of about a 55 gallon drum. It's roughly 35 cubic feet. In Colorado, which has very, very restrictive asbestos laws, these trigger levels are much smaller. So in a single family residence, that trigger level for walls and ceilings is only 32 square feet, which is a really small amount. You can think of it as, maybe the standard size sheet of drywall or sheet of plywood. That's 32 square feet. So that's your trigger level. And then it is 160 linear feet of cove base or small steam piping, and still that volume equivalent of what we can put into a 55 gallon drum. So these are trigger levels, and you want to make sure that your staff, maintenance staff, restoration contractors like CRC, that they absolutely do not exceed these trigger levels.
All right. So Michael, and we'll get into this, I know, a little bit later.
Yeah.
Hey, it's wet. We walked into, I don't have to worry about it. I made it non-friable because it's wet. And hey, by the way, you know what? It's 32 square feet.
Mm-hmm.
Good. I'm seeing a lot of these maintenance guys kind of come in. Hey, I'm going to cut out 32. They knew it was hot already from testing.
Yeah.
But are they free and clear then?
No. And this is a very, very important part of our discussion here today, Tyler, because there are many different entities involved with this whole asbestos topic. What we're talking about here is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. They've said, okay, greater than 1%. They've given us guidance on our trigger levels, 32 square feet. But where a lot of people forget is OSHA. OSHA requirements are very, very stringent. So yes, you have to know what's in a building. You have to know how much to remove, follow the EPA guidelines. I took some notes because I wanted to make sure that everyone can take notes on this. So OSHA has a bunch of different standards, and it's for worker safety and occupant safety. It's called an asbestos in construction rule. It's 29 CFR 1926.1101. And basically what this regulation does is it gives guidance and law regarding about the construction and maintenance and renovation with asbestos. In this law, the OSHA has broken the types of work activities for asbestos work into 4 different categories. There's class 1 work, there's class 2 work, there's class 3 work, and class 4. What we run into most commonly is class 4 and class 3. So class 4 work is basically custodial work in a building. That's where there's asbestos in a building, but you may come into contact with it, but you will not disturb it. So that's really important to know. It's a 2-hour awareness course for any building that has asbestos in it. You must train your custodial staff annually. It's a 2-hour asbestos awareness. Where a lot of people get tripped up, though, is in class 3 work. And class 3 work is defined as where maintenance personnel who perform duties that involve small scale, short duration removal or repair of asbestos containing material. What they have defined as small scale short duration is what one can fit into a glove bag no bigger than 60 inches by 60 inches. So that's basically 5 feet by 5 feet. Further, this law states that if you are going to disturb more than 10 square feet, now remember, EPA is 32 or 160. With OSHA, it's 10 square feet. You are then required to start in asbestos activities, asbestos abatement activities, where you're supposed to have a clean room, a shower room, negative air pressurization. Think asbestos abatement project. This is where a lot of folks get tripped up. They think, well, I can just go in and I can remove 31 square feet and I'm going to be just fine. You are with the EPA law. But what you're not doing is you're opening up yourself and your organization to, breaking OSHA law, and you're opening yourselves up to OSHA fines when you exceed 10 square feet. That's where a lot of contractors, a lot of building owners, a lot of maintenance companies, they really get tricked up. And so that's a really important topic to discuss. Did I answer your question?
That answered the question perfectly. And you know what, I bring this up because I've walked into many times, and I think this 32 square feet is the important portion of this that I have walked into so many times, and it's become pervasive a little bit that somehow that 32 square feet of the EPA standard, and that's the direct distinction. People are relying on that. Maintenance staff are relying on that. They're not trained. They've taken that out and been like, they've heard this 32 square feet. It's ingrained in their head. That includes insurance adjusters. That includes contractors, maintenance staff, property managers. And so I'm seeing it as we walk into different projects and somebody just raises their hand and goes, I'm good. Yeah. And so, I think it's a huge distinction, the liabilities and life safety of everything. So you take anything out of this presentation, I want some of these people to understand the distinction between the two. And I think you've covered it great.
Yep.
I appreciate
Wonderful. I want to also follow up with the training requirements for OSHA. So you don't get these OSHA fines, but if you are going to be removing up to 10 square feet, and this could be a maintenance person, it could be a restoration worker, whatnot, you're required by OSHA to go through a training. It's called 16-hour O&M, 16 hours operations and maintenance. Anybody who disturbs an asbestos containing material up to 10 square feet, up to 32, however you want to look at that, they are required by OSHA regulation to go through operations and maintenance training annually. I can think of many of our clients who are not properly trained for this work. It's something to take back to your entities, because the thing about it is when you're dealing with in Colorado, for example, the 32 square feet, well, that's great. That's Colorado. And if you ever work with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, they can be tough, and rightly so. But OSHA is a federal law. It's a federal agency. And when you start messing with the feds, life can get very uncomfortable super quick. We're going to continue on here. Was there a question there?
In relation to 32 square foot and a maintenance team, gathering material or disposing of it, let's say somebody walks by and sees it and calls it in, and the state comes out and it's hot. What kind of fines are they looking at?
Sure. So a couple different ways to look at that, Heather. The way that I'm going to look at it is with the state law, with the federal law as it's defined by the EPA. And this is law. The fines are up to $25,000 per day per event. So if you go into a building and you have disturbed greater than 32 square feet or 160 in a commercial building, what you have done is you have created what's called a major asbestos spill. Those are very bad because a lot of things are triggered by law to happen. You immediately shut down your HVAC system. You immediately call your environmental colleague like us. We have to come out, suits, respirators. We call it spill delineation. We have to start doing samples. to see how far these asbestos fibers, if they did travel, if they did, how far did they go, how many rooms and levels of the building are impacted. We are also required by law to fill out a major asbestos spill notification form, and we must report that to the EPA and to the state of Colorado, for example, within 24 hours. So we can't just go into a place and say, well, this looks bad and leave. We are required by law to contact the enforcement agencies, the regulators, and then they become involved and they can red tag a building. I've seen it happen after a big fire. If someone in there knowingly, very egregiously disturbed over the trigger levels of an asbestos containing material, that's where the $25,000 per day per event. It's a very, very hefty fine. So the EPA, you can see this table here. This is right off the EPA's website. They estimate it has been added and is still being added to over 3,000 products that goes into the built environment. Here are some interesting ones. Boiler and furnace insulation. We see a lot of those in commercial properties. Adhesives, caulks, ceiling tiles, siding, older siding on residential structures primarily. Back in the day, you can see here they used to add it to hair dryers because it didn't allow much thermal energy loss, or it kept all the electrical components cool. And so they would just add it to anything that they could ever think of. Textured surfacing material, that's what we call texture. Vinyl flooring, roofing materials, it's added to anything. If you look over here in the third column, brake pads and clutch discs. When we was talking about OSHA, there is a part of the OSHA law specifically for automotive repair companies and brake pads, because they would add it to brake pads because when you press on the brakes, there's a lot of heat generated. And what they were finding is older mechanics had a really high rate of getting one of these cancers. And think of it, what are you going to do if you're going to change the brakes out? You put it on the lift, you lift the vehicle up right here so you can work on it, which is right where our mouths are. And so a lot of older automotive mechanics have a cancer from asbestos. So it's really interesting. They would add it to just so many different things. This is right off of Colorado's website, and I want to bring your attention to the lower portion. Wasn't asbestos banned? If you talk to anybody in our, Tyler, how many times have you talked to a homeowner or a business owner? And they say, well, my home was built, or my building was built in 2009. There's no asbestos. It's been banned in the United States. Actually, it has not. Back in 1991, the EPA tried to ban all asbestos and for every application in the United States. And it went all the way to the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. They vacated most of it. So there are only, by law, 6 different items that are banned there's only 6 items that are banned by law that have asbestos in it. And most of these are corrugated rolled fiber board as it relates to roofing. So asbestos is not banned in the United States, folks, except for these 6 items. Interestingly, if you're going to do some drywall work in your home or business, you can go to Homes or Lowe's Home Depot or Lowe's, and you can look at the products for joint compound. And if it says something of, it might say naturally occurring mineral, or it might say naturally occurring silicate, and you test that, a lot of times that actually comes back as asbestos containing. Everybody thinks it's banned in the US, and it absolutely is not.
And I will jump in. That is one we've had. One's tested hot for asbestos or positive for asbestos in drywall containing material on a 2009 build. And I'm sure, Michael, you have ones beyond that or newer than that. And so we get a lot of insurance companies, we get a lot of maintenance people that do ask that question. Well, why are you testing? This is that age. As general practice, that's CRC, I'm speaking in terms of CRC, we require it regardless what's going to happen, because we need to know the propensity and we want to protect life safety of our individuals. So knowing that it's out there and it doesn't have an age limit is another important facet that appreciate you bringing up.
Yeah, absolutely, Tyler. We found it in a home that was remodeled in 2018. And so it is still out there, still in use. And that's why, the laws are so stringent. It doesn't matter when your building is built, regardless of age, at least in Colorado, you must test. So this wall behind me, if we installed this yesterday and we want to tear it out today, we're required to have it tested. Our average, out of the many thousands of samples that we collect over the course of a year, we find asbestos in about 11 to 13% of those samples, regardless of age.
And I'll add too that ultimately when we're testing and what we find with this construction and drywall or anything along those lines, that we really, again, we're protecting life safety. And so having a contractor that tests all the way through, you being aware of it, is just going to protect you and your individuals on all levels. But it is an important facet to it. And
it's so true. At the end of the day, as an environmental consultant, we want to do a couple important things. Number one, we want to protect the health of us because we're potentially exposing ourselves to it every day. We want to protect the health of the occupants, whether it's a worker, a business person in an office space, but we also want to protect the value of the asset. And what I mean by that is you don't want maintenance staff or somebody coming in to do remodel in your big building and they blow asbestos fibers all over the place because they just are not clued into this. So that's a fantastic point.
And I will say a lot of, if it's a permitted project, most of the construction, if we're getting beyond a certain amount of fire corridor or anything like that, and it is a permitted job, a lot of the municipalities, regardless now, are before you do demo or pull a demo permit, apply for your permit for the rest of the building, they're going to ask, where was your asbestos testing? So the municipalities are becoming educated on this. It's going to be something that's part of the claim, part of your construction process, and should be integrated into the whole entire thing.
Certainly is. There's a lot of municipalities around now that they will not issue a demo permit until they see an asbestos inspection report. It's just the way it is. The EPA has classified asbestos into 3 different categories. We have thermal systems insulation, that's TSI. Think of steam piping and boilers. Surfacing material, that is anything that can be spray or hand applied, and that's most of the time we're talking about textures. And then miscellaneous material is everything else. So if it's not steam piping and if it's not a texture, it's everything else. That includes vinyl flooring, roofing, grout, ceramic tile, mastic, and glued on carpets, you name it. That's the catch-all there. Have some pictures here of where we found asbestos over the years. In the upper left, we've got a boiler and pressurized or a pressurizer there. Steam piping. The bottom picture is a cross section of steam piping that we took off. You can all see all these little honeycombs or little air pockets in there. I really, really caution anyone that ever works around steam piping or TSI. Over the years, we have never had this material come back less than about 85% asbestos containing. It's really loaded. Additionally, it's very friable, meaning it can be crushed. It can go airborne very easily. My advice is if you ever need to work with any of this, you close the door, you have it tested, and you immediately go into an asbestos control like an abatement. This is just very, very high asbestos content. Here's our textures we were talking about. We have that lovely popcorn texture, different swirls and shapes, orange peels. When we go into a building, obviously we still have to test for it, but when we see these older styles of textures, we become a little bit more cognizant of it because we know it's probably asbestos containing. This is what product is called vermiculite. It looks like this little gravelly stuff here. It's usually under bad insulation in homes, and in older commercial buildings that are cinder block, they would build the cinder block wall and then dump in this vermiculite from the top. Again, it was used as an insulator, usually contains about 7 or 8% asbestos. Ceiling tiles. We've tested many thousands of ceiling tiles. The newer ones, if they're 2 foot by 2 foot or 2 foot by 4 foot, they generally won't. In the right picture here, I'm pointing, this is 12 by 12 ceiling tile here. That's actually glued to drywall or plaster here. The ceiling tile does not usually contain asbestos, but it is these little hockey puck looking things. This mastic, this adhesive is usually 6 to 8%. That's where we will find that. Vinyl flooring, whether it's 9 by 9, 12 by 12, even here, sheet vinyl flooring contain asbestos. I used to think before I got into this that you would not find asbestos in sheet vinyl flooring. Actually, this backing material, this papery stuff here usually contains about 20 to 30% asbestos. It's very, very high asbestos content, but you can see the black mastic on this ceramic tile here, or on this vinyl tile. It can be in any of these three different types. Roofing materials, this is an older roof here. It's kind of looks like a cementitious material. You can see just the asbestos fibers hanging off here. A lot of tars, mastics, commercial roofs in the rolled on material, and also in the tars that they would apply. The lower picture here, I showed you a picture earlier about cinder block. This is actually solid block material, but we found asbestos in the mortar that they put in between the blocks. Here's some of that older cementitious home siding I talked about. When it's hit, it cracks and it crumbles, but it usually contains asbestos in it. Here's some different piping systems. Here's a water supply to an apartment community we found. Here's that knob and tube wiring I was describing earlier. You can see the asbestos fibers wrapped around the copper lining. This is on top of a roof, and you can see there's a vent pipe here, but it has all of this fibrous material in it. This is actually the heat exhaust for a water heater, a gas water heater. So the gases are exhausted out with the heat. Obviously, you don't want the pipe to get so hot that it starts your attic on fire. So they would just layer and layer and layer it with asbestos containing material there. You can see that it was just added into many, many different building products. And then we're going to wrap it up with some different laws. HERA stands for Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act. This was the law that really started asbestos awareness in the United States. And what that said is if you had a school, that you were required to know what is in the school. And even if a new school is built today, well, let me back up. HERA stated that all of the schools in the United States by October 12th, 1988, must have been inspected for asbestos. If it was found to contain asbestos, it should have been identified, and a management plan should have been written for that asbestos on the response action. Are you going to manage it in place? Are you going to remove it? Just whatever happens. So a HERA is for schools. A few years after that, they came out with what's called a SHERA. And a SHERA is basically what it does, it is applied to commercial and public buildings. And it said that whenever anyone was going to test for asbestos in one of these buildings, they must have been certified as an asbestos building instructor as described in a HERA. So basically we have a HERA for schools. Now we have a SHERA for all of the other commercial public buildings. And then we have a NESHAP, which is in the National Emission Standard for Hazardous Air Pollutants. This describes how asbestos containing material first must be removed and then how it must be disposed of, and it all has to go into a landfill, and it has to be covered every day. So if we take a load of asbestos containing materials, it has to go into an earthen cell. That cell has to be covered up by 6 inches of soil every day. Very restrictive on how this hazardous material is handled. And then the states can actually manage the federal law in-house if they want to. That's what Colorado has done, and that's where Colorado Regulation 8 comes in. The states were allowed the ability to manage it. They couldn't water down the law, but they could certainly make it more stringent, and that's what happened in Colorado, for example. And that's where the 32 square feet came into effect. There are other states. Texas is another state where it is regulated a little bit differently than the feds. That's where everybody in each state must know how is asbestos regulated in my state, because it may vary from state to state. And then the last thing not on here is OSHA. This is the one that really, really tricks people up because they think, well, the trigger levels are this, so I can do that, when in fact the trigger level is way, way much less. And we do not want to expose ourselves to any type of fine or anything like that. Something that I consider, and I tell all of our clients for Element Building Sciences E2, is that use us as your environmental risk manager. If you are unsure, give us a call. We'll talk to you about it. And then, what are some activities that can cause asbestos to become airborne and disturbed? Building renovations, of course. This is, if there's a water damage or fire, something like that. If you have a commercial building that you're going to go do a a remodel in for a new tenant. So building renovations, building tear downs or demolitions. This is if you have a building, doesn't matter if it's a home or if it's a building, commercial building, you are required to know what's in it. And we actually do a way different inspection on these. A good way to think of a building renovation is when you're going to be working with cosmetic items. So think vinyl flooring and drywall and things like that. Demolition is defined as when you're going to start disturbing any load-bearing members. So if you're going to remove a building, the inspections that we're required to do, it's called a full demolition inspection. And that's where we're bringing out hammers and saws. We're even sampling brick, mortar, concrete. We're busting up the concrete slab. We're making holes in things because we want to visually confirm that there's no old wiring or vermiculite in it. And then obviously anything after a catastrophe, a storm, a fire, flood, hurricanes, our company works nationally. And so we do a lot of asbestos inspections, primarily in the Gulf states after hurricanes or tornadoes go through. So anytime you're going to be disturbing, and that's a really important word for everyone to remember, disturb. If you're going to be disturbing anything, you better know what's in it. And because that's how all of these laws are worked.
Michael, so along those lines, I wanted to have everybody understand too, because I get a lot of people, we walk in and I say, all right, well, we're going to be testing for asbestos as we start this project. And somebody goes, oh, wait a second, I've got a test. And it's 8 years old. General regulations, general good practice that we would be aware of for older reports or anything along those lines that people should be aware of?
So that report may be good. We always run into the scenario, Tyler, of let's say we have a water damage, okay? So we do the right thing. We have that material tested for asbestos, but we don't take it all out. We're going to do a 2-foot flood cut, a 4-foot flood cut. We put in the new material, we retexture, we paint it so it all matches, and then we go on down the road. That asbestos inspection was only good for the materials that were in place before you removed them. So now if you're going to go into the same building and remove that new material, you're required to have that tested for asbestos. It's kind of like this wall behind me, right? We're going to remove the wall. So we test it, take the wall out. There's no asbestos in it. And we decide, well, you know what, we're going to save the wall. So we put on new drywall and things like this and texture it. You cannot use the results from the previous inspection because that material is now gone. So you're required to have the new material tested. We really encourage folks, although not required, and we usually caution folks that, an asbestos inspection, the report, the lab results are only good for about a year. Comes into play quite a bit in property management, actually, multifamily housing, hospitality, because things are always happening. You're always doing little patches here and there, little leaks and whatnot. But that new material that you put on there may contain asbestos. We've already talked about that. It may be good for some material, but not all. That's why we always say it doesn't really matter if it goes longer than a year. We recommend just having a second set of eyes, somebody who's licensed and knows about this to at least come in. We'll do a visual inspection. And if we see any patches, we're gonna ask you, like, okay, when was that patch put in here? If it's newer and it wasn't part of that initial asbestos survey, you're required again to have that tested. Great question.
Great. I appreciate you qualifying that, and for our participants as well, in understanding that just make it part of the process.
Of course. So we're going to wrap it up here. We talked about what it is. It's a rock, why it was used. It was cheap, and just go dig it up. The 3 diseases caused by asbestos, all of them, many different products that we find in the built environment. Again, remember EPA says it's at least 3,000. The laws, as we talk about, EPA and OSHA, and then some common activities that result in either disturbing or discovering asbestos. And with that, we're going to toss it into our question and answer session.
To get started, Tyler or Mike, if asbestos is found during a project, like what are people looking at as far as maybe extending timelines on the project to then have to deal with the asbestos?
Michael, do you want me to take that first, or would you like to?
Yeah, please.
So from a general contractor standpoint, I'll get this kind of passionate, is sometimes when you don't have testing for asbestos on any of these projects, a lot of times we find ourselves being pulled in as a general contractor to provide scopes and bids for projects. And that's what is expected. People start asking those questions. Well, again, the first question I may ask is, well, have you tested for asbestos? And it's really important because ultimately, if they haven't, frankly, to be blunt about it, you've wasted everybody's time, because coming out to look at jobs and take care of this, because if you don't know the propensity of this job site and it comes back hot with asbestos, everything's going to stop anyway. So that needs to be mitigated, that needs to be abated first, and that can add on the commercial side and national side that we deal with on a lot of bases. It can add hundreds of thousands of dollars and stretch that time frame for months at a time. It's a great question. Yeah, it can adversely affect your timeline schedules. And so if you're trying to come in right off the bat, I understand setting some budgetary numbers from an insurance standpoint. We can kind of usually walk in and go, give you some of those, but understand that it's not going to be very accurate until you have those engineering and testing items done. So you know what the makeup of the building is and where you're going to have to go from point A to point B and getting there with all points in between. Very important to get tested because it's going to affect everything you do following that test coming out. It can simplify it or it can make it very complicated.
Yeah, truly. And it also triggers, from the regulatory standpoint, some notifications that are required by law. I've seen some projects, these are just not well-run projects where asbestos testing wasn't even considered. So they go in and they start doing their demolition and whatnot. And someone says, well, hey, wait a minute, didn't we test for asbestos? The answer is no. Stop the project. And it comes back asbestos containing. Well, now we're in a problem here. We probably exceeded those trigger levels. Where I was going with this is if you a test up front, the EPA, and if you're going to remove this, you're supposed to fill out an application to get an asbestos abatement done. It automatically kicks in a 10-day requirement where the EPA, you cannot begin work at a minimum of 10 days before the project because the EPA has to review your demolition permit. They have to review your asbestos inspection. So there's even some timelines built into the process that people are unaware of.
Okay, here's a question. You covered older reports. What about recent reports that come from another unit in the same property?
So there is an ability, and it's very defined here. Let's talk about two different buildings. Let's talk about an apartment building. Apartment buildings, and let's say it had a really bad fire in it, and you say, okay, we want to test for asbestos. If we can reasonably conclude that the construction happened all at the same time, all with probably the same materials, all by the same general contractor. We do not have to test all of those individual units for that. We are allowed, we have to first visually confirm that everything is the same texture, same flooring, for example. And then we can decide, or we can say, okay, to us, this looks homogeneous. And if it's homogeneous, then we can go ahead and sample about 20% of those rooms. So in a hotel, for example, let's say we have 100 rooms that are impacted by water, we're going to still walk through and make sure everything looks the same and is homogeneous. But then we're going to pick and choose and just kind of random representative sample of those different guest rooms. Same thing for an apartment building. When it comes to condo buildings, that's different though, because condos are individually owned single family homes. And that's where we do have to sample each home because, and what I do in my home, well, I might want to move a wall or something and my neighbor over here wants to do some other things. And so that's where we're required to sample each unit individually. And then as we go out into the common spaces, the corridors and stairwells and things like that, it's a different sampling strategy there. So it really depends on the usage of the building, who owns the building, and some different things like that.
Here's another one. What responsibility, EPA or OSHA, does an employer have for limited exposure for something minor, such as occasionally replacing boiler gaskets that contain asbestos?
Both of those, if I understand the question correctly, so the workers, whoever the workers are employed by, that's where OSHA is, because as employers, we're required to care for our workers and to follow all of the OSHA regulations. The building owner, those are ones who actually legally own that asbestos that's in the building. So there's two different entities here. So the building owners, they're required to manage that asbestos, whether it's abate it, remove it, manage it in place, whatever. But property management companies, anyone who hires maintenance staff, for example, those are the entities that are required to watch out for their workers. And so it's kind of two different answers to that. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Mike, I have a question. Do you mind I hop in, Sarah?
Yeah, go ahead.
So if you have an older report from another unit next door, let's say here, and something happens, can I use that report for this space if it's two different multifamily units? Can I use that report for here? if it's a year old?
I wouldn't. I guess technically you can, because, again, if it's an apartment or something like that, you could. I think you're running a great risk. I would really caution you to individually test that next unit. Believe it or not, asbestos inspectors are just like a lot of other ones, a lot of other occupations and trades. There's some really good ones and some ones that just are not the best. And so that's where I would say, here's how I would guide you on that. Give us a call first and let's talk about it. Let's talk about the age of the building, what actually has happened in that one unit, things like that. So where a lot of people get tricked up on this is, let's say we have an apartment community and, back in the day, they would have a water damage or some type of maintenance event or something. And so they would test for asbestos in a few areas. And finally they just said, you know what, we're tired of spending money on this. We've had multiple inspections and asbestos has never been found. So we're just going to assume that asbestos was never used at site-wide or in this building or whatever the building is. That is not legal, first of all, and it is very dangerous because you have not met that 20% sampling strategy. You haven't had a licensed person come out and confirm homogeneity, all of these different units, all of these different buildings. And so you're running quite a risk there. And just always remember, the law is that if you are going to disturb more than those trigger levels, and with OSHA, it's 10 square feet, you are required by law to test. And I know it's a hassle and it costs money and all of that, but can be opening yourself up to some pretty stringent and costly enforcement actions.
Okay, and since we are kind of right at time, we'll do one more question and then wrap up. Can you guys touch on any regulations when it comes to area-wide disasters or something, say, following a hurricane?
Michael, you want to take that one first?
Yeah. So a lot of times the states become involved and they will relax sampling and disposal requirements occasionally. Colorado, we have wildfires and they'll burn 30, 40, 50 homes or structures, something like that. So then what they'll say is, and a lot of times there's really not much other than just some debris and ash and things like that to test anyway. So what they'll say is, okay, we're going to remove the requirements or relax the requirements for testing. Disposal, though, is a NESHAP. That's a federal law. And so what they'll say is, well, you can bring a dumpster out, you can line it with plastic, you can put all of this burned debris into there, but it still has to go into a landfill double wrapped in 6 mil plastic. Burritoing is what it's called. A lot of times in the Gulf states, asbestos testing is relaxed after hurricanes and large freeze events and things like that. But just remember this. The asbestos testing requirements are from the EPA. I can never think of a time in almost 30 years of doing this where OSHA has relaxed any regulation for worker or occupant safety. So, okay, yeah, you can come into this hotel or this apartment community and you don't have to test for it. You are still on the hook for OSHA. And being one of the two business owners, one of the two owners of this company, Element Building Sciences, along with the headaches that come with, the things, taxes and all of that with business ownership. A thing that I really enjoy is I get to choose who we do business with and who we do business with not. And CRC is one of our valued trade partners because, as Tyler said before, it doesn't matter what you're up against. It doesn't matter when it was built. It doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. We're going to test because it can save a lot of headaches in the back end. Well, yeah, the EPA says this, but a lot of people forget about OSHA. Again, the states may relax testing requirements, but I've never seen OSHA relax anything when it comes to worker occupant safety.
And I appreciate that point, Michael. And I think from this whole exercise is, again, from our standpoint, from a liability standpoint on business, we're always going to cover our liabilities. We don't want to get caught when that time frame of relaxed regulations in a hurricane zone or something like that ends. Are you halfway done, halfway not? What are you going to do at that point in time? It just, from a procedural standpoint, from a general contractor standpoint, it doesn't make sense. And then what we were just talking about, as far as we've seen a lot of this, hey, 32 square feet's been cavalierly thrown around the market, and people are just taking that arbitrarily, that the OSHA regulations are more stringent. They have never been relaxed. And I think that's the huge point of this discussion is people truly understand and have the knowledge base of what's going on and protect their liabilities as business owners and their life safety. Again, we go back to life safety and that's ultimately the most important of everybody getting involved. So I think that's huge. I think that's obviously educational for everybody that's been on the call and in the future as this kind of goes out across the country.
Thanks, guys. And a big thank you to Mike and Tyler for sharing their expertise and their time with us today. As we wrap up, just a couple of notes. Their contact information is on the screen. If you'd like to reach out to either of them directly with additional questions, please feel free. Thank you again for joining us, and this will conclude our webinar. Hope you all have a great rest of your week.